Subscribe to my YouTube channel for deeply emotional, romantic, and mature stories that echo through your heart. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support meaningful storytelling. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, sealing Sarah Chan inside with the one person she'd been trying to avoid for weeks. Daniel Morrison stood in the corner, his dark suit impeccable despite the late hour, his presence filling the small space like a storm cloud heavy with unspoken words. The fluorescent light flickered once, casting shadows across his angular face, and Sarah wondered if this was how her carefully constructed professional world would finally crumble. 3 months ago, she would have called him Mr. Morrison. 3 months ago, she would have kept her eyes fixed on the floor numbers lighting up one by one. But that was before the night that changed everything, before one stolen moment transformed her from a dedicated marketing coordinator into a woman haunted by the memory of lips that tasted like coffee and regret. Sarah. His voice was low, careful, like he was handling something fragile. We need to talk. She pressed herself against the elevator wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. I don't think that's a good idea, Daniel. The use of his first name hung in the air between them, intimate and dangerous. She'd earned the right to say it that night 6 weeks ago, when the corporate retreat had turned into something neither of them had planned, when professional boundaries had dissolved like sugar in rain, and she discovered that the man who commanded boardrooms with quiet authority could be just as vulnerable as anyone else. The elevator lurched slightly, and Sarah's stomach dropped not from the mechanical hiccup, but from the way Daniel's eyes found hers in the mirrored walls. Those same eyes that had looked at her with such raw honesty when he'd whispered her name in the darkness of his hotel room, before reality came crashing back like a cold wave. The Peterson account, he said, his voice strained. You've been avoiding the meetings. Sarah almost laughed at the absurdity of discussing work when her entire world felt like it was balanced on a knife's edge. I've been busy with other projects. Sarah, please don't. She held up a hand, and he fell silent. Don't make this harder than it already is. The elevator dinged softly as they passed the 20th floor. 22 more floors to go. 22. More floors of breathing the same air as the man who'd kissed her, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life, only to pull away moments later and remind her that he was married, that this could never happen again, that she meant too much to him to destroy her career over his moment of weakness. But it hadn't felt like weakness. It had felt like coming home. Chapter 1. The beginning of everything. 2 months earlier, Sarah had been just another face in the crowd at Morrison & Associates. She'd joined the prestigious marketing firm straight out of graduate school, armed with ambition and a master's degree in communications. Her cubicle was on the 15th floor, far from the executive offices where Daniel Morrison made decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. She'd seen him, of course. Everyone had. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying tall, with prematurely silver hair that made him look distinguished rather than old, and a presence that could silence a room with a single glance. At 38, he was young to be running such a successful firm. But Sarah had heard the stories. How he'd built the company from nothing after his mentor's death. How he'd revolutionized digital marketing strategies. How he'd never lost a major client in 15 years of business. What she hadn't expected was for him to know her name. Sarah Chen, he'd said one Tuesday morning, appearing at her cubicle like a well-dressed ghost. I've been reading your campaign proposals for the Henderson Group. Sarah had nearly choked on her coffee. Mr. Morrison, they're good. Very good. He'd perched on the edge of her desk, And she'd caught a whiff of his cologne, something expensive and understated that made her think of autumn leaves and late nights. "I want you to present them to the client next week." The promotion had been swift and unexpected. Suddenly, Sarah found herself in client meetings, working directly with Daniel on high-stakes campaigns, staying late to perfect presentations that could make or break multi-million-dollar deals. She discovered that behind his intimidating exterior, Daniel was patient, brilliant, and surprisingly kind. He remembered her favorite coffee order, asked about her family, and never once made her feel like she didn't belong in rooms filled with executives twice her age. "You have good instincts," he told her one evening as they worked on the Hartwell Industries pitch. The office was empty except for them, the city lights twinkling beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Sarah had looked up from her laptop to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. There was something in his eyes, a softness that made her breath catch. But before she could analyze it further, his phone had buzzed with a text message. "I should head home," he'd said, his voice suddenly distant. Rebecca's making dinner. Rebecca, his wife, the woman whose photo sat on his desk in an expensive silver frame, whose charity galas he attended, whose existence Sarah tried very hard not to think about during the long hours she spent working alongside her husband. But in the quiet moments, when Daniel would lean over her shoulder to point out something on her computer screen, Sarah couldn't ignore the way her pulse quickened, or how he seemed to linger a second longer than necessary before pulling away, or how sometimes, when she caught him looking at her, she saw something in his expression that mirrored the confusion in her own heart. The corporate retreat to the Ashford Mountain Resort had been Rebecca's idea. Daniel had mentioned casually. A team-building weekend for the senior staff, complete with trust exercises and motivational speakers. Sarah had packed her bags with reluctance, unsure how she'd manage an entire weekend of pretending that her feelings for her boss were nothing more than professional admiration. The resort was beautiful in that understated way that screamed expensive taste. Rolling hills dotted with autumn maples, a lake that reflected the sky like polished glass, and accommodations that felt more like a luxury spa than a corporate retreat. Sarah's room was on the second floor, with a balcony that overlooked the gardens and a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud. The first day passed in a blur of team building, exercises, and networking sessions. Sarah found herself partnered with Daniel for the afternoon activities, and she tried to ignore how natural it felt to work alongside him, how their minds seemed to sync effortlessly when solving problems or brainstorming solutions. "You're quiet tonight," her colleague Marcus observed during dinner. "Everything okay?" Sarah forced a smile and pushed the gourmet salmon around her plate. "Just tired. It's been a long week." Across the dining room, Daniel was seated at the head table with the other executives, his wife notably absent. Sarah had overheard him on the phone earlier, his voice tense as he spoke to someone about a flight delay and a missed connection. Rebecca wouldn't be joining them after all, apparently. Some crisis with her art gallery that required her immediate attention. Sarah told herself she wasn't disappointed, told herself it didn't matter that she wouldn't have to watch Daniel and Rebecca together, wouldn't have to smile politely while the woman who had his heart made jokes about his workaholic tendencies. But as the evening wore on and the wine flowed freely, Sarah found herself stealing glances at Daniel more often than she should have. He looked tired, she realized. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when she'd first started working for him, and his usually perfect posture seemed to sag slightly under some invisible weight. When the official dinner ended and people began to drift away, some to the bar, others to their rooms, Sarah found herself on the resort's back terrace, breathing in the crisp mountain air and trying to clear her head. The stars were brilliant here, away from the city's light pollution, and she found herself thinking about how different her life had become since joining Morrison and Associates. 6 months ago, she'd been living in a studio apartment eating ramen for dinner and wondering if she'd ever find work that felt meaningful. Now, she was at a luxury resort, wearing a dress that cost more than her old monthly rent, and nursing feelings for a man who was so far out of her league. It would have been laughable if it weren't so painful. Beautiful night. Sarah spun around to find Daniel standing in the doorway, his tie loosened and his jacket draped over his arm. He looked younger somehow, more approachable, and Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses waver. "I was just getting some air," she said, suddenly aware of how intimate the terrace felt with just the two of them. "Mind if I join you?" He didn't wait for an answer, moving to stand beside her at the railing. "I needed to escape the networking for a while." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the resort reflect on the lake below. Sarah was acutely aware of Daniel's presence beside her. The way he smelled like expensive cologne and something uniquely him. The way his fingers drummed silently against the railing. The way he seemed to be wrestling with something he couldn't quite put into words. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd met under different circumstances?" The question hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Sarah's heart pounded so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "Daniel, I know I shouldn't ask." He turned to face her, and the moonlight caught the silver in his hair, making him look like something from a dream. "I know this is complicated. I know I have no right to even think about it, but you do," Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. "Think about it, I mean." He nodded, and she saw something break open in his expression, like a dam giving way to a flood. "Every day, every time you walk into my office, every time you smile at something I've said, every time you stay late to perfect a presentation that's already perfect, because you care about the work as much as I do." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing him voice the feelings she'd been carrying alone for months. "This is crazy," she said, but she didn't step away from him. "I know." He reached out as if to touch her face, then let his hand drop. "I know it's crazy. I know I'm married. I know you work for me. I know all the reasons why this can't happen. Then why are you telling me?" "Because I'm tired of pretending I don't feel this way about you." His voice was raw, honest in a way that made Sarah's chest ache. "Because I'm tired of lying to myself about what this is between us." The space between them seemed to shrink, and Sarah found herself taking a step closer, drawn by something stronger than logic or reason. "Daniel, I know I'm being selfish," he continued, his eyes searching her face. "I know I'm asking you to carry something you shouldn't have to carry. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, it's not just attraction. It's not just some midlife crisis or a moment of weakness. It's love," Sarah finished, the words falling from her lips before she could stop them. He stared at her, and for a moment, she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. The wonder, the fear, the desperate hope that maybe, somehow, this impossible thing between them could be real. "Yes," he whispered. "It's love." Chapter 2. The kiss that changed everything. Their admission hung between them like a live wire, dangerous and electric. Sarah felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that one more step would send her tumbling into a free fall from which she might never recover. But looking at Daniel in the moonlight, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, she realized she'd been falling for months already. "I need to know something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Your marriage has been over for years, Daniel said quietly. In everything but name, Rebecca and I. We've been living separate lives for longer than I care to admit. We stay together because it's easier than dealing with the alternative. Because neither of us wants to face the failure. Sarah felt a mix of relief and guilt wash over her. Relief that she wasn't the other woman she'd feared she was becoming. Guilt that she felt relief at all. Why haven't you? Divorced? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because I'm a coward. Because I've been telling myself that as long as we maintain the facade, I haven't completely failed at something important. Because I've been waiting for a reason to be brave. He took a step closer, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. I think I've found my reason. The logical part of her mind screamed warnings about office politics, about the complications of dating a married man, about the professional suicide she was about to commit. But the louder part of her, the part that had been aching for him, for months, whispered that some things were worth the risk. What happens now? She asked. I don't know, Daniel admitted. I've never been in this situation before. I've never felt this way about anyone before. Not even. He trailed off, unable to say his wife's name. Sarah understood. This was uncharted territory for both of them. A landscape without maps or guidebooks. All they had was the truth they'd finally spoken aloud, and the electric current that seemed to arc between them whenever they were in the same room. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. The honesty in his voice made her decision for her. Sarah closed the distance between them, her hand reaching up to touch his cheek. His skin was warm, slightly rough with evening stubble, and she felt him lean into her touch like a man who'd been starving for gentle contact. Sarah. He breathed her name like a prayer. She didn't know who moved first. One moment they were standing apart, the next she was in his arms, her back against the terrace railing, his lips finding hers with a desperation that spoke of months, of restraint finally breaking. The kiss was everything she'd imagined and nothing like she'd expected. It was tender and fierce, desperate and reverent, a conversation conducted in touches and sighs that said everything they'd been afraid to voice. Daniel's hands tangled in her hair, and she could taste the wine on his lips, could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her chest. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah felt as if the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked the same, the stars, the lake, the resort glowing softly in the distance. But she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I should go, she said, but made no move to leave his arms. You should, he agreed, but his hold on her tightened. They stood there for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, caught in the space between what was and what could be. Sarah memorized the feeling of being held by him, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and breakable, the way her name sounded when he whispered it. One more, he said quietly, and she knew he was asking for another kiss, another moment, another memory to carry them through whatever came next. She nodded, and this time when their lips met, it was softer, slower, like they were trying to pour all their unspoken promises into a single touch. When they separated, Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'll see you tomorrow, she managed to say. Sarah, wait. He caught her hand as she turned to go. Whatever happens, whatever we decide, I need you to know that tonight, this moment, it's the most real thing I've felt in years. She squeezed his hand, memorizing the feel of his fingers intertwined with hers. For me too. Sarah walked back to her room on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She'd kissed her boss. Her married boss. She'd told him she loved him, and he'd said it back. She'd crossed every professional line she'd ever drawn for herself, and the terrifying part was that she didn't regret it. In her room, She sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the phantom pressure of his kiss. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister asking how the retreat was going, and Sarah found herself staring at the screen, unable to formulate a response. How could she explain that in the space of one conversation, one kiss, her entire world had been turned upside down? How could she tell anyone that she'd fallen in love with a man who was technically unavailable, who was her boss, who could destroy her career with a single word? That even as the rational part of her mind catalogued all the ways this could go wrong, Sarah couldn't bring herself to wish it hadn't happened. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe freely. The weight of unspoken feelings had been lifted from her chest, replaced by a different kind of tension, the electric anticipation of possibility. She changed into her pajamas and tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's face in the moonlight, felt his hands in her hair, heard the way he'd said her name like it was the most important word in the world. Chapter 3. The morning. After Sarah woke to sunlight streaming through her hotel room curtains and the immediate, crushing weight of reality. In the harsh light of day, the magic of the previous night felt like a dream or a nightmare, depending on how she looked at it. She'd kissed Daniel Morrison, her boss, her married boss, the man who signed her paychecks and controlled her career trajectory, the man who could fire her without explanation, who could make her life at Morrison and Associates a living hell if things went badly between them. Sarah rolled over and buried her face in the pillow, groaning softly. What had she been thinking? She'd worked so hard to get where she was, had sacrificed evenings and weekends to prove herself in a competitive industry, and now she'd potentially thrown it all away for a moment of weakness. But it hadn't felt like weakness. It had felt like the most honest thing she'd ever done. A knock at her door made her sit up abruptly, her heart racing. She glanced at the clock. 8:30 a.m. The morning session didn't start until 10, but maybe someone needed something for the presentation. Or maybe Sarah. Daniel's voice, muffled by the door, made her freeze. Are you awake? She considered pretending to be asleep, but he'd probably heard her moving around. With a deep breath, she wrapped the hotel robe around herself and opened the door, leaving. The chain lock engaged, so only a few inches of space remained. Daniel stood in the hallway, looking as if he'd slept about as well as she had. His hair was slightly mussed, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of a long, sleepless night. We need to talk, he said quietly. Sarah's stomach sank. Here it comes, she thought. The speech about how last night was a mistake. How they needed to pretend it never happened. How she was a good employee, but this could never work. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know what you're going to say. Do you? He looked genuinely curious, and Sarah realized she had no idea what he was thinking. The man who could command a boardroom with absolute confidence looked as lost as she felt. You're going to say it was a mistake, she said, still speaking through the crack in the door. That we got caught up in the moment, that it can't happen again, that we need to maintain professional boundaries. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Is that what you think last night was? A mistake? The question caught her off guard. She'd been so busy preparing for rejection that she hadn't considered he might feel differently. I don't know, wasn't it? Sarah, can I come in? I feel like I'm having the most important conversation of my life through a hotel door chain. Against her better judgment, Sarah unlatched the chain and stepped back to let him in. Daniel entered the room and closed the door behind him, then turned to face her. In the morning light, she could see the conflict written plainly across his features, desire warring with responsibility, hope battling with fear. I haven't slept, he said simply. I've been thinking about last night, about you, about what this means. And I need you to know that I don't regret it. Not the kiss, not what I told you, not any of it. Sarah felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble. You don't? No. The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to be honest with you. With myself. He ran a hand through his hair, making it stick up in a way that was oddly endearing. I've been miserable for months, Sarah. Watching you, working with you, wanting to tell you how I feel, but knowing I had no right to complicate your life with my feelings. You weren't the only one who was miserable, Sarah admitted. Daniel's eyes searched her face. What do you want, Sarah? If we could have anything, if there were no complications or consequences, what would you want? The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. Sarah knew the safe answer, the professional answer, but looking at Daniel in the morning light, she found she didn't want to be safe anymore. I want you, she said simply. I want to see where this goes. I want to wake up next to you and argue about campaign strategies over coffee and find out if what we have is as real as it felt last night. Something shifted in Daniel's expression, like a weight being lifted from his shoulders. I want that too, more than I've wanted anything in years. But Sarah could hear the hesitation in his voice. But I won't ask you to be my secret. I won't ask you to hide or pretend or compromise your integrity, because I'm too much of a coward to fix my own life. He took a step closer, and Sarah felt that familiar electric current arc between them. I'm going to file for divorce, Sarah. I should have done it years ago, but I've been taking the easy way out. That ends now. Sarah's heart pounded. Daniel, I know it's complicated. I know there will be paperwork and lawyers and probably some very ugly conversations. I know that dating your boss is career suicide under normal circumstances. But I also know that I can't go back to pretending I don't love you. The word love hung between them like a bridge, and Sarah felt herself stepping onto it despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. What about work? What about the company? I've been thinking about that too. Daniel's voice was steady, determined. I'm going to recommend you for the promotion to senior associate. It's a lateral move that would put you on Marcus's team instead of mine. Same pay grade, same responsibilities, but it removes the direct reporting relationship. Sarah stared at him, processing what he was saying. You'd do that? I'd do anything to make this work, Sarah. To make us work. He reached out and took her hands, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her knuckles. I know I'm asking a lot. I know I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with a man who's technically still married, who comes with baggage and complications, and a very messy divorce in his future, that I need you to know that what I feel for you, it's not going anywhere. It's not something I can turn off or ignore or pretend doesn't exist. Sarah looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. She saw hope there, and fear, and a vulnerability that made her chest ache. This was Daniel stripped of all his professional armor, offering her his heart with no guarantee she wouldn't break it. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay, let's try. Let's see what happens when we stop fighting this and start fighting for it instead. Daniel's face broke into a smile that was like sunrise after a long night. He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah felt like she was coming home to a place she'd never been before. I love you, he said against her hair. I love your brilliant mind and your terrible jokes and the way you bite your lip when you're thinking. I love how you make me want to be better than I am. Sarah pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears. I love you too. I love how you remember everyone's coffee order, and how you never take credit for ideas that aren't yours, and how you make me feel like I can conquer the world. This time when they kissed, it was different from the desperate passion of the night before. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a leap of faith taken together. It was the beginning of something neither of them could fully imagine, but both were willing to fight for. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah rested, her forehead against his. So what happens now? Now we go to the morning session and pretend we're not completely crazy about each other, Daniel said with a rueful smile. And then we go home and figure out how to build a life together. That sounds terrifying. It is terrifying. But it's also the most hopeful I've felt in years. Sarah nodded, understanding completely. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, about to jump into the unknown. But they were jumping together, and somehow that made all the difference. Chapter 4. The return to reality. The flight back to the city was torture. Sarah sat 3 rows behind Daniel, watching the back of his head and trying to act normal while her entire world had shifted on its axis. Every time he turned to speak to the colleague beside him, she caught a glimpse of his profile and remembered the way he'd looked at her that morning, the promises they'd made, the future they'd decided to build together. Marcus, seated beside her, was talking about the quarterly reports, but Sarah found it impossible to focus on anything beyond the man in seat 12A and the way her life was about to change, in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. "You're quiet," Marcus observed, closing his laptop and turning to face her. "Not still thinking about the Henderson presentation, are you?" "Because that was brilliant." Morrison looked genuinely impressed. Sarah forced a smile. "Just tired. It was a long weekend." "Yeah, but productive. I heard through the grapevine that you might be getting that promotion to senior associate. Moving to my team." Marcus grinned. "I'd love to have you on board. You've got great instincts." The promotion. Sarah had almost forgotten about Daniel's plan to remove their direct reporting relationship. The thought of not working directly with him anymore caused a strange pang of loss, even though she knew it was necessary. "Nothing's official yet," she said carefully. "Well, when it is, I'll be the first to congratulate you." Marcus returned to his laptop, and Sarah was left alone with her thoughts and the constant awareness of Daniel's presence just a few rows ahead. The plane touched down at JFK at 4:47 p.m. on a grey Sunday afternoon. Sarah watched Daniel gather his things and walk down the aisle, his movements efficient and professional. He didn't look at her as he passed, but she felt the brief touch of his fingers against her wrist as he moved by a secret message that made her heart skip. By the time she collected her luggage and made it to the taxi stand, he was already gone. The city looked the same as always, concrete and glass and endless movement, but Sarah felt like she was seeing it through new eyes. Everything was different now, changed by promises made in moonlight and confirmed in morning conversations. Her apartment felt strange when she walked in, like she was seeing it for the first time. The carefully arranged furniture, the art prints. She'd chosen to make the place feel more sophisticated. The stack of work files on her kitchen counter. All of it seemed to belong to a different version of herself, the woman who'd left for the retreat 3 days ago. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, and her heart leaped before she even looked at the screen. "Are you home safe?" She stared at the message for a long moment, still hardly believing this was real. Daniel Morrison, her boss, the man she'd been secretly in love with for months, had just texted her to make sure she got home safely. "Yes. Just walked in. You?" "About an hour ago. Rebecca's at her sister's for the week. We need to talk when she gets back." Sarah's stomach clenched. Rebecca. The wife. The woman whose existence had been an abstract concept until now, when she was about to become a very real complication in their lives. "How are you feeling about that?" "Terrified, but also relieved. This conversation is about 15 years overdue." Sarah typed and deleted several responses, unsure what to say. How do you comfort someone who's about to destroy their marriage for you? How do you offer support without sounding like you're pushing them toward a decision that will upend their entire life? I'm here if you need to talk. About anything. I know. That means everything to me. Sarah set her phone aside and tried to focus on unpacking, but her mind kept wandering to Daniel and the impossible situation they'd created. By tomorrow morning, they'd be back at the office, surrounded by colleagues who had no idea their world had shifted. They'd have to pretend to be nothing more than boss and employee while navigating the complex emotional minefield of a relationship that technically shouldn't exist. The thought of seeing him in a professional context, of having to maintain appropriate boundaries when all she wanted was to touch him, to talk to him, to continue the conversation they'd started at the retreat, made her chest tight with anxiety. Her phone rang, startling her out of her spiral of worry. Daniel's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah's heart began to race. Hello? Hi. His voice was warm, intimate in a way that made her sink onto her couch. I know I just texted you, but I wanted to hear your voice. Is that pathetic? If it is, then I'm pathetic too, because I was hoping you'd call. How are you doing? Really? Sarah considered the question, trying to put words to the complex mix of emotions churning in her chest. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm excited and terrified and completely overwhelmed. I keep thinking about tomorrow, about going back to the office and pretending nothing has changed. I know. I've been thinking about that too. Have you thought about what you're going to say to Rebecca? Daniel was quiet for a long moment. I've been thinking about that conversation for years, actually. I just never had the courage to have it. Now I do. Because of me. Because of you. Because of how you make me feel. How you make me want to be honest about everything. Even the things I've been lying to myself about for years. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I don't want to be the reason your marriage ends. You're not. Daniel's voice was firm. Certain. My marriage ended a long time ago, Sarah. Rebecca and I have been living like roommates for years. We're both too proud to admit we failed, too scared to face the complications of divorce, too comfortable with the status quo to make the hard choices. But comfort isn't the same as happiness, and I'm tired of settling for comfortable. What if she fights it? What if she doesn't want the divorce? Then we'll figure it out. But I need you to know that I'm not asking you to wait for me indefinitely. I'm not asking you to be my secret or my mistress or anything less than what you deserve. I'm asking you to be patient while I clean up the mess I should have dealt with years ago. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision she'd already made. I love you, Daniel. I'm not going anywhere. I love you too. More than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. They talked for another hour. About everything and nothing. About their fears and hopes and the complicated logistics of building a relationship in the shadows of his marriage. When they finally hung up, Sarah felt both better and worse better. Because she'd heard his voice. Worse because she already missed him. Chapter 5. The longest week Monday morning arrived with the crushing weight of normalcy. Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, applying makeup with shaking hands, trying to prepare herself for the performance of a lifetime. She had to walk into Morrison & Associates and pretend that nothing had changed, that she was still the same dedicated employee she'd been before the retreat. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt eternal. Sarah stared at the numbers lighting up one by one, remembering the last time she'd been in an elevator with Daniel, the way he'd looked at her, the electricity that had crackled between them. Today, she'd probably see him in the hallway, and have to nod politely, professionally, while her heart hammered against her ribs. Sarah! Marcus waved her over as soon as she stepped off the elevator. Perfect timing. Morrison wants to see you in his office. Sarah's stomach dropped. Now? Now. Something about the Henderson account. The walk to Daniel's office felt like a march to her execution. Sarah knocked on the doorframe, her mouth dry, her palms sweating. "Come in," Daniel's voice called. From inside. He was seated behind his desk, looking every inch the professional executive in his navy suit and perfectly knotted tie. But when his eyes met hers, Sarah saw a flash of something that made her breath catch warmth, longing, and the shared knowledge of secrets that couldn't be spoken aloud. "Close the door, please." Sarah did as he asked, her heart pounding. Being alone with him in his office felt dangerous, intimate, like they were tempting fate. "I wanted to discuss your promotion," Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. "I've spoken with Marcus and he's eager to have you on his team. The paperwork should be finalized by the end of the week." That's great. Thank you. There's something else." Daniel stood up from his desk and Sarah noticed the way. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie. "I wanted you to know that I spoke with Rebecca last night." Sarah's world tilted. "You did?" "I told her I wanted a divorce. That I've been unhappy for years and I think she